Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the final panel. And I can assure you it's going to be a great conversation. Let me start with some context. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, Andreas Baader, the former leader and co-founder of the Baader-Meinhof gang, German terrorist group, made a point of talking to his new recruits, and he said the following: whoever is here has to be tough, has to be able to do the work, and if they're not able to do it, there's no place for them. The only way out is feet first. We know from decades of research since then that that is absolutely not true. People can change, people can leave, people can and do get out of violent extremism and extreme violence all the time. How they do this? Well, it varies from person to person, place to place, context to context. Sometimes people get out because of something that they do. They want to get out on their own terms. Sometimes people get out because of an intervention. I'm sure you're all very familiar with many, many case studies and success stories of people who have disengaged and who have left and who have thrived. But it's not just at the end process or the end part of the radicalization process where we see these successes and these changes. This transition can also happen before people even cross the Rubicon, as it were. So I am truly honored to share a stage with three extraordinary people doing some of the most impossibly challenging work in this space. They are all involved in providing direct services for people contemplating acts of extreme violence. So Yusuf, David, Emma, let's have a conversation. How about we begin with just a basic introduction to what, in your experience, constitutes a good intervention, we'll call it.
I'll start. David O'Brien from Yorktown Family Services, and I run an intervention program in Toronto, Canada called ETA, Estimated Time of Arrival, which is an intervention program similar to my colleagues here to my left. What constitutes a good intervention program is having the systemic foundation to actually support staff, to actually operate in this space, having the, backing of the organization that you're working for, right from the board of directors, from the CEO. I think also looking at building systems and infrastructure to support us doing the frontline work. And so having relationships with partners, in particular law enforcement. The reality is each of our agencies, including the one that I work for, at times deal with some of the most at-risk individuals. And so understanding and knowing where those safety risks may lie for your staff. And so feeling safe, having those strong infrastructures in place, for me, for my organization, would certainly be their priority, because otherwise it's really challenging to move ahead. And if you don't feel safe or you feel insecure, it's going to be difficult for you to engage with clients who are at that risk point of mobilizing potentially to commit an attack. And I can say at Yorktown, we've had 250 individuals referred to our program since 2020, and about 25 to 30% any given year have began to mobilize to commit an attack. So you really have to have that secure infrastructure, those partnerships in place at times of security services to be able to not let that distract you from engaging with the individual in front of you.
Sure. Well, good day, everybody. Despite my Belgian background, where we're supposed to be known for our modesty, I'll have to be a bit arrogant because I'm going to share a personal story. Myself, being in my teenage years, watching certain types of videos, being in a very bad spot in my life, full of grief, full of anger, reflecting about everything that's going wrong in the world, specifically in the Middle East, because of my Muslim background. I know, if I remember that moment in my life, how upset I was and how I was looking for the bad guys and how violence looked as the only option. There were a lot of tears, a lot of shouting, there was a lot of crying in my life then. And if I think about myself, about the intervention that happened in my life by my own brother, who was lucky enough, or I at least was lucky enough, to have a brother who was knowledgeable enough to understand my griefs, to know where I'm coming from, and to try to think of a different way. And years later, I'm sitting here today where I am, partially because of that experience, and thinking of how my brother helped me, saw a human being in me, despite my full of anger and very negative, even toxic view, being willing to be harmful to other human beings. He knew there was a capacity for a better way, another way. And I think that is what I have learned when I'm dealing with these youngsters and sometimes adults who say the most terrible things, who really long for violence, is that you always believe that there is a way to bring them back. There is more than that. It is how important it has been, and that is part of our work today, to be knowledgeable in the narratives that exist today, sometimes very harmful narratives. A counselor needs to be quite well learned in these topics, but then has to try to look for a different way out. Because what do we do with these grievances, with these emotions, with these tears and anger? And that is primarily what we work with in our organization. We know all these theories, conspiracy theories that exist. We recognize them to a certain degree. We work with these people, and then we find a better way. And the emotional process that these individuals undergo in this long trajectory, because we deal with these people on certain months, sometimes even years, but to see that beautiful human development, being a minor, being an adult, being someone with migrant background, or being someone from the country itself, to see that always that same human development is part where we focus within our organization, because we know that that is central to the work that we do.
Okay, Emma Cardelli from Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, clinical psychologist, and I am running a program, clinical director for a program called the Massachusetts Area Prevention Program. John, I want to make sure I fully understood your question correctly. Were you asking specifically about kind of how to judge when an intervention is good, or programming? Repeat the question for me again.
I guess what I'm getting at is what makes for an effective intervention?
Intervention specifically,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
That's okay. So I guess I'll just say, like, how do I guess I'm going to answer it through the lens of, like, how do I know what I'm doing on a one-to-one level? How do I know it's effective, it's working, right? And ditto to everything David said on the programming level as well, because I completely agree, as someone directing a program, that is totally what needs to be there, and good indicators of success and effective programming. But on the intervention level, it can be like, it's very simple stuff oftentimes, like true, genuine engagement. Like, is there really, when I'm sitting with somebody, is there really, are they truly here with me, open and engaged in a conversation that we're having? Is there increased trust over time? And that may not just be between the client I'm working with and me as a practitioner, but also that trust ideally would extend. I have a youth-facing program that I work in, so it's the family also trusting me more and more. Is the service systems around that particular youth, are they trusting in our work more and more willing to come to the table and partner? That makes a huge difference. Is there collaboration in our efforts? It's not just me saying X, Y, and Z needs to happen for somebody. Somebody in their engagement is truly coming to the table to collaborate with me to help me understand what their needs are and in how we're going to address that. These kinds of things, I think, go a really, really long way in determining, is what I'm doing actually truly working? Am I instilling hope? Is there an actual, like, cognitive opening of, oh my God, wait, things could be different. Maybe I could handle the problem in front of me differently than how I think I have to handle it. So those are all these micro little ways.
Terrific. And so there's been so many discussions over the last 2 days, yesterday in particular, around, I mean, in so many panels where a constant refrain is, well, how are we defining success? And I'd love to hear from your perspectives and experiences about what that means. So, I mean, it can be these tiny signs of progress. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
I think you define success about why is your program existing? Like why are you in that space? I think for a program at Yorktown, our primary goal is to stop violence. It's pretty clear, right? It's very difficult to do, but clear. And so I think the marker for us is that if you're in our program and you've moved away from talk of violence or planning or preparing, and if you've done this work for a while, you'll realize a lot of people that we work with actually talk a lot. And you know, we've had countless numbers of youth in particular come to us and say, you know, I'm kind of on the edge. I bought an ISIS knife through Amazon, and I'm actually maybe mobilizing to do something. And they've told us. So at times we'll collaborate with law enforcement to de-escalate that person. But I think it's important to know that success for us depends on what your objective is. And our objective is to reduce violence. And so with the 250 referrals we've received, 30% have been mobilized or redirected by security services back to Yorktown for many different reasons. These are folks who really were beginning to make online threats. They were planning, they were collaborating with transnational actors and recruiters, gathering materials when they were referred to us. Out of that 30%, out of 250, we've had one arrest for terrorism. That's pretty amazing. And so you can have a lot of screeners, tools, and measures. I think that's an important stat. The other piece, too, is that, at least at Yorktown, we're really good at moving people away from violence, but it's still challenging moving people away from ideology. Yeah. So people can move away from, you know, I want to hurt people, to I still believe in the cause, but I'm not really willing to go that extra mile anymore to kind of hurt people or encourage other people to hurt their peers or community members. And so for us, that's a success in our space.
Is there, can I just pick up on that? Is there a risk that we sometimes place too much emphasis on ideology at the expense of other issues? I know this is a tricky and contentious issue, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, we don't talk about ideology. I think what we've learned over the last 5 years is that ideology talk gets you into power struggles. In fact, the people who are embedded in ideology want to fight. They're expecting us to challenge them. They're expecting us to out-ideology them. And actually, very rarely do we talk about ideology. We create a pathway or an off-ramp of an alternative lifestyle out of what they're currently engaged with. So, you know, repairing family relationships, critical thinking skills, teaching people that it's important that you control information, that information doesn't have control over you. And that, you know, often that's a light bulb moment for people because the recruiters, all these online hate communities are spewed with this disinformation which revs them up. But, you know, we point out, it seems like despite your freedom of speech rant, that information's really controlling you. So these kind of critical thinking skills and then underlining mental health issues, and really at the end of the day, building communities around people that are pro-social. We find that to be the most effective intervention. So social networks that are going to foster positive growth in people. So one by one, we introduce new people to them and build communities. And you know, all the other interventions are very effective, but that seems to be the one what people are really looking for.
Yeah, I think it's important that you said there's a bit of tensity around this subject about whether or not ideology matters or not. And to us, specific within our organization of CPIRE, ideology does matter, and it matters to a certain degree. What we often see is that the traditional institutions that exist, and I think not only in Belgium but abroad as well, is that they sometimes don't experience the necessary success that they would hope to achieve with these individuals. And that's usually when they come to us as, who are you going to call? Well, not the Ghostbusters, but in this case, you will call CPI. And we do tackle ideology, but why do we do that? Because in a lot of cases, ideology is for certain it can be a facade or a veneer. But what we experience with these individuals is that these great things that you just hear, and we adhere to that as well, is that they're often not open to it, because you have to build a certain type of trust and respect. Not only trust, but also respect. And often what we experience, why other institutions, even local institutions, have failed to achieve success, is because that individual in and of itself, can be a man or a woman, it does not matter, doesn't feel that that council has earned his or her respect. What does that mean, to earn respect? Is that that person wants to know when he or she says something about their ideology, their way of life, their thinking, theories, can be conspiracy theories, political theories, that you as a council, you know what they are talking about. You don't have to agree with them. These individuals do not expect from us that we agree with them, but they do expect from us to a certain degree when they mention certain phrases, certain words, certain historic developments, that we know what they are. And that builds that level, not of trust necessarily, because that's something different, but that level of respect. And then we can focus on those other needs that are so important, like the notion of what we just heard, critical thinking. But again, we experience that if it is, I won't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to jump to that phase of critical thinking if you haven't built in the first phase this notion of respect through authority, through knowledge. And then you can go, because to answer your first question was, how do we see that success? We see success with a person at the beginning of their development, where only talking, and not only with us, also when they're confronted by a judge or local enforcement, they're only talked about and seen as part of an ideology. You know, you're part of the far right, you're part of Islamic extremism, and you're only questioned about that. You're hardly questioned about your feelings, etc. And that person has decided to keep those feelings for themselves, doesn't trust them, doesn't respect them. At the end of the trajectory, when respect is built, when trust is built, then they are open to talking about their vulnerability, their hurt, their pains. And that is for us a major sign of success.
I promise this is the last question I'll ask about success and metrics for success. It sounds like you all work in team settings where there's a lot of collaboration. Do those metrics for progression and success look or feel different depending on who in your team we might be asking this question about?
I mean, I guess I'll start and say, yes, to some extent. And it depends on, too, how we're defining the team, right? So I'll take our example at Boston Children's Hospital. We have a team of providers from different disciplines who work together in order to stabilize violence risks, support a family. Then you have a broader team that ultimately you're building, a broader team of formal and informal supports around a family system that is also ideally really should, again, be part of that collaborative service planning process and really needs to be engaged in reducing risk of violence, or else nothing's going to generalize outside of a therapeutic space if you're not working out in that environment as well. So when I first think of that multidisciplinary team we work with within our own center, we all have a certain role to play, per se, in somebody's healing journey. And we're going to ideally be really clear about what is each person's role and why. If somebody's coming in and their primary role is to play a key role in an initial strengths, risk, and needs assessment, give a detailed feedback to a family, help a family understand what are the next steps, but not necessarily to walk alongside a family while they're going to engage in all of those steps. They're going to look at they're going to have different indicators of success, you know? For the case manager, it's going to be really, really different. Who's looking for indicators of, like, what I'm referring this family to. Is there true uptake and engagement? Are they going? Are they showing up?
Okay.
Are they allowing me into that space? That kind of thing versus the therapist, let's say, on the treatment team. And then, like I said, I mean, I always really like to reflect on teams way outside that healthcare environment. Who else do we recruit to be a part of somebody's, again, healing journey? Who in the natural environment are we pulling on to help us all accomplish a really difficult feat? And I do think we need to leave space for all of those different, how do I say that? All of those different practitioners and family members too, to be able to identify for them, you know, like, what is the source of pain? What do they need to see different to know that their child would be okay, that things ideally are going to look more hopeful in the future for that family system? And we need to honor their perspective on that in determining how do we know if at least we're moving slowly towards growth, towards success. So everybody's going to have their own take.
Yeah, I think also, and I'm sure in our agencies, that the individual we're working with, as I mentioned earlier, they're surrounded by these communities that are influencing them to move forward with attacks, cause disruption, and sometimes that's all they have. In fact, they talk about that. Like, actually, I'm not into the ideology so much, but they're my friends, kind of thing. So, and I think sometimes our team is the first point of contact in terms of a new community. So people who've been with us for a while will have relationships with our team members, with the organization. And that's the first step of actually pulling them out into a wider, more sustained social network, right? So sometimes that team acts as that social network because people are really literally isolated in these communities. And as you know, when you're in these communities, you're sort of influenced by all the negativity, the hate speech, the propaganda. And even if you want to move out, you've lost your friends, you've lost your family sometimes. So the agency becomes that bit of a pseudo-family as a transition into the wider community. So I think that's something we didn't expect and something that's been actually a positive outcome. As long as we don't send a message that we're your sustained support, that we are going to move you on to other networks and other pro-social folks.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said
Yeah,
that. And that
have to.
framing needs to, like,
Because they'll go back, right? 'Cause
Exactly,
We're not there forever. And so through the relational care that you guys have been talking about is that they build bonds with us, but we also have to help them understand we're not permanent fixtures. Because if we pull out, guess where they go? They go right back in.
yeah, and we do not want to be responsible for creating any more wounds.
That's right, more harm.
Is this potentially an increase in concern given the apparent rising number of cases facing agencies?
Given the, sorry, John, say that.
Given, I mean, the more cases we see, I mean, how is this sustainable as an approach? I mean, is this something that we're going to have to think about now, or is it a longer term issue?
I think we need every healthcare professional in Canada, North America, Europe, Asia, doing this work. And I think there isn't enough resources to manage what we're managing in an effective way. We know what works. And it's unrealistic to think that every case we work with that's high risk, we can have this type of model, this specialized model. So I think what's important, and one of the learnings is, and maybe some success is happening because we're seeing more and more individuals and organizations begin to think about this work now, at least in Ontario, Canada. But really, and that's a success, a small success we see evolving, but really in order to really be effective here, there'll never be enough resources. So it has to be kind of seen as a systemic approach or systemic change. And Emma, you and I have talked about we need social workers to deal with violence and be able to engage with people that commit violence. We've talked about that for a few years, and I think we have to lead that and lead that capacity building, the early adopters.
So what do we do to affect change on a larger scale then? Something I often hear from mental health professionals is that they're quite nervous about dipping a toe in these waters, partly because of the stigma of extremism and ideology.
Personally, we focus a lot on the field of education when we're talking about prevention, because prevention is always better than having to cure the situation. And what we experience in Belgium, but I don't think Belgium is necessarily unique in that aspect, is that a lot of work on prevention that could be done in education is not always done or not efficiently done. And this has nothing to do with the teachers themselves, that always have the goodwill and energy to stand in front of the class and to talk to this new young generation of pupils and students. But sometimes there's also a lack of knowledge, a lack of feeling confident in talking about certain topics, of being afraid of when do I become too political, when do I become too subjective, when am I doing my objective work as a professor, as a teacher in prevention, and when am I trying to push a certain type of narrative on my students that I don't want to do. But whenever we counsel, specifically I'm talking about youngsters, but also people who were just left the schools, and these individuals are around 19, 20 years old, and we talk about these things that they learn online, these narratives, new types of ways, the way they look at the world. A lot of times we ask them, are these types of things that you would discuss at school, in your classroom? And the answer would almost always will be no. And when we would ask them, did you feel comfortable at that time, if you felt the need, to discuss these things with your teacher or somewhere in school? These narratives that you were learning, these new ways, these theories, conspiracy theories. Again, once again, the answer was always no. And so what happens is that these certain types of they become micro communities, start bubbling up under the surface, and that the first line of defense, if I can call the people in education the first line of defense, are not always tackling with these narratives. And they are becoming, because we're living in a new type of age where it's not like 30, 40 years ago where your teacher was your only or your major source of information. What your teacher told you, what happened in the world, how history has developed, that is how you will look at the world. We're living now in an age where youngsters are seeing the teacher as merely as one of them, not even necessarily the most important source of information. So they learn something from 8 to 4 in school, and after they go home and they're in the online digital world or with their friends, and they learn different type of narrative, and they learn critical questions. And for example, they learn, well, you know, during World War II, did the Holocaust really happen? How do we know that many Jews got killed? Was it really the fault of the Germans? Or perhaps are we not getting the full story? And so that is what I mean when we try to focus on the field of education, seeing as our teachers being the first line of defense, tackling, not being reactive, but being proactive, knowing that our students are hearing all these types of narratives and being proactive in that. I think that is super crucial to this line of work, looking towards the future, where of course digital information is becoming more of a challenge, not less of a challenge.
If I can add, in the spring of 2023, we were asked to support the return of women and children from Syria who joined Syria. They left Canada about 2015, 2016, and it was a monumental task, given the resources we had for a particular intervention program. These were women who had birthed kids in the ISIS camps. The kids that came into this world were exposed to sexual violence, violence against women, torture, bombings, war. So it's one of the most horrific, conditions I've ever heard of in my career. And so we said as an organization, how are we going to do this, right? Like how? And luckily that where Yorktown has our ETA program, which is embedded in an organization with 30 programs. So we have early childhood development, we have infant mental health, early years mental health, and we knew the children really needed to be assessed around their developmental milestones and all the things that had prevented them from healthy growth in Syria inside the camps, the ISIS camps. And so one of the things we said is that we actually have to get all of our staff on board outside of this program. And I thought to myself, how am I supposed to tell the infant mental health worker that, by the way, next week you're getting a referral from a potential ISIS member who has kids and who's come from Syria? And it's going to be all over the media. It was breaking news in Canada. Media were calling us, asking where are the women? Like it was just a frenzy. And so really what we did is began a process about a year before to desensitize some of our staff that weren't in the program. and really look at the underlying reasons as to why potentially these women ended up in Syria, the trauma they experienced, and the trauma that the children experienced. And when you take away sort of the glam and the terror, the words of terrorism and extremism, and you're left with a human with all these challenges and barriers and things they engaged with, you're really left with what we typically do at Yorktown in a lot of ways, sadly. Sadly, there's kids that are malnourished in Toronto, there's kids that are abused, there's kids that witness domestic violence. And so in a lot of ways, that really demystified another success for our staff who are not part of this program. Oh yeah, this seems familiar actually. There's nuances, of course, but this seemed familiar. So depoliticizing the language in a lot of ways, which fuels extremism, which makes me want to become an extremist because I have this great label now. That's really scary. Depoliticizing that, helping people understand, at least from our perspective, the behavioral health issues that are deficits and need strengthened, right? Was a success with that particular project.
I agree completely with David. I mean, in our program, we've taken a very similar approach to kind of capacity building, both within our hospital, outside, and across the country, quite frankly, in terms of training other mental health providers. It's so important to like humanize violence and aggression. It is a human phenomenon, period. And to find ways to increase empathy and compassion, critical. And to help people see that in many ways, like you were saying, we pull off these other layers, like, you know how to do this. Like, this is so similar to the work that you do within infant mental health, right? Like, but people need to see the parallels, that it's something familiar, actually, and something in many ways they have a lot of competencies in. And in that, you're gonna reduce fear, to approach when they see those familiarities. I will say, in addition to kind of the workforce development side of this, from my perspective, and I think a lot about like healthcare policy in the United States and what may need to change in order to have this work be more sustainable. I will say there's just, especially when you're embedded within a hospital like Boston Children's Hospital, it is so hard to do community work. It's really, really, really hard to actually convince an institution like that it is critical to actually go out to a family, not expect them all the time to make the journey to you, not only for the assessment phase of the work, but also in rapport building, in intervention. Like, we need to be able to go into families' homes, to go into schools, to go into medical appointments, to advocate for clients, to be present and wrap around in that way. Of course, with transparency that we're not there forever, but to do that. And traditionally in our healthcare system, now folks are talking more and more about things like social determinants of health, but in your traditional healthcare system, social screening is not done as much as it needs to be, and providers are often not incentivized to provide services outside of what they believe is directly related to like symptomology, a clinical disorder. And so, I could go on and on about all the different ways that the healthcare system needs to change, but if we can have showing up at a school meeting be seen as a valuable service by insurances, by payers, for example, this work does become easier then for the provider to do.
What has been the reaction from teachers to this? What has been the reaction from teachers to that kind of approach?
Yeah, so I'll say, for the teachers and the school systems that we've worked with, we've really had the privilege with our school partnerships to actually show up and build partnerships with the schools and then accept referrals directly from the schools, so that ultimately, even from the get-go, it's like you're showing an on-the-ground presence, which matters a lot for schools. Everybody's there 5 days a week. If you're gonna just kind of expect to pick up the phone and chat with the teacher about how to do things, or that doesn't always work, right? You want to be able to show that you are on the ground, that you are partnering in services together. And the fact that our school-based partnerships really have required us first to just come to an agreement through MOUs to work on things the schools care about as well, and then to accept individual referrals. It's made for such a seamless partnership because then we are all working together from the get-go, and you're just adding the individual client needs on top of that. That being said, you know, I do think as a society, like, it tends to be, I hate to be negative about this, but I think for a very long time, institutions, not just schools, but institutions in general, have responded to violence, concern for violence, through punishment and get them out. Punish, get them out.
They're too difficult.
Yeah, they're too difficult. So when you're trying to make a case for actually, hold on, this is a behavior, let's see what's underlying, what's underneath that. There can be times, of course, when it has taken our program longer than we would like to help school personnel really see a kid's humanity, a family's humanity in all of this, to have compassion, to see the unmet needs. Once you get them there, then it seems like everybody can kind of come to the table. You also have to make sure that when you're talking to schools, like, ideally, you're making very clear that if the school partners with you on X, Y, or Z, this kid will show up as a more productive learner in your classroom. So you have to really tie it to the learning environment and what they care about in that way as well.
Okay. David, Yusuf, what are some of the challenges you have faced in all of the time you've been doing this work?
None.
None. Great. Moving on.
Where to begin?
Yeah. I think
Biggest persistent
yeah,
challenge.
I'm going to tie into success though too. So I think the persistent challenges is we get from our colleagues in the mental health field in Canada is, why do you do this? I think the other piece too, and so that gives us an opportunity to actually, okay, so if you don't know why we do this, we're going to come and do a training for you. So we're seeing people beginning to gather more knowledge about why we do it. And I think even internally, we've had some people say, why are we doing this? Why are we in this business? And so once we do those capacity buildings, people then come back and say, I totally get it now. You know, because I think, again, when we think of terrorism, extremism, we think of these hallmark events and tragic events, but these hallmark events. And so that's what people see. There's also a whole entertainment industry based around terrorism TV shows, right? And so I think the demystifying of that, and that's the challenge, that's the biggest challenge we have is, you know, and especially with the schools, right, is that how do we kind of have a conversation, how do we educate the professionals to demystify this, make it more accessible for them, right? Because traditionally terrorism has been with intelligence services, policing, and that's what the general public thinks it is. You know, and you know, terrorism and extremism can be many different things. So I think demystifying a success that we're having is we're demystifying, right?
I think in our line of work, what we experience often, which is a human understanding, but we still find it a shame, is this notion of the moral panic, when certain types of professionals experience a moral panic. And when does that happen? When you hear something that sounds terrible, that sounds inhuman. And sometimes a teacher or someone who works in a closed institutions or even in the prison system, when he or she has to deal with these individuals and you talk about the certain topics, what we find sometimes is that there's still too much of this moral panic of asking questions of, well, how could you say this? But that's terrible. And these types of moral respondings, which is human, of course, because they collide with your own frame, the way you look at the world as a human being. But the professional should really skip this notion of a moral panic, because the moral panic confirms in the idea of the one who you're counseling this notion that it's him against the world, or it's that the world does not respect him or understand him or doesn't know where they are coming from. Let me give you certain examples to make it really concrete. Moral panics happens when there are terror attacks happening in society. The day after, in schools, there are discussions, for example, or even perhaps sometimes at work, and you ask certain, oh, how did you feel? And some of the pupils or students say, well, I'm glad it happened. And then when the professional has this moral panic, it's a human response, but it is not the most efficient response. Because once you create that moral panic, that person just learns, what does he or she learn? I have to be quiet about it. I cannot talk about this subject because this person does not understand me. So that's why we always try to deal in our trainings, is how to skip this notion of the moral panic, and how do you deal with notions of very extreme reactions that you sometimes might hear. And lastly, to add about that, what we also find something detriment to our work is that of course, once again, it's a normal response, is that prevention gets a lot more traction when there are terror attacks. Then everybody's on the phone and we're making phone calls. Let's make things happen. Let's have trainings. Let's have this trajectory, interventions. And then 1 month passes and then suddenly you see that the interest is gone. Like, it's not our problem. It was in that city. It won't happen in our city. We don't have this. And then guess what? That happens, and then once you get, so you're often in that cycle. And what we try to do when we're talking with our partners in trying to make them, once again, to learn that prevention is better than cure. Yes, you think it might not happen, but you wouldn't be the first person or city or place or institution to have that notion that it only happens somewhere else. So that's why to be very strengthened in your professional care, teaching, spreading that specific knowledge, so that when it does happen, when you do hear certain things in your workplace, in your city, municipality, in your schools, that you are already prepared, that you have a field of people who know what to do with these type of challenges, and once again, skip the moral panic.
Emma, what's been your biggest source of frustration or challenge with this work?
I don't know if I'd say this is the biggest per se, but I will say what's coming to mind right now is, especially because I'm in a role where I am supervising frontline clinicians in our programming doing the work, and man, provider burnout is a real thing. It just makes me sad because the work our team is doing is excellent. It's just excellent. It's really incredible work, and it's much needed. A lot of who ends up coming to us are folks who are just falling through other cracks in other service sectors and other service systems. And the reality is it does take a lot to be a helper in this space. It does. And we try as hard as we possibly can to create a community within our own program so that people feel held and supported in this work. But I just would love to see more and more and bigger, broader communities of practice so that people don't feel like they're left to worry alone and carry this burden alone. And I think we really need to think as a field more and more about how to do that so people stay, so good people stay.
David, Yusuf, we have less than 2 minutes. Any final thoughts?
I think the field is growing. I think compared to even a year ago, I know at least in my area, there's mobilization happening and people are engaging with this. I do agree with Emma around the systems of support. Yeah. I think there's a working group. Plug to that one. But yeah, really systems of support. And in Canada, we have the Practitioners Network headed by Haida Hassan that provides that community. Because the extremists have a community, we need a community, right? And I think that's a way to really build capacity. I know my colleagues really rave about talking to other programs across the country and even into the US now. So there's that sense of common purpose and common vision. And I think that's where that support lies, at least now, until there's more local and regional programs developed. So.
I'll connect it back to what we discussed in the beginning with this notion of success. What I always communicate with the people that I'm counseling is telling them that I don't expect them, or we as a team don't expect them, to be at the end of a trajectory to be a perfect human being or the perfect citizen. You will still have your flaws, you'll have your better days, not so good days, but we're trying to work on certain things. You will have your moments where you fall, you feel really bad about yourself, you might even feel ashamed about yourself. That is all part and parcel of this human process that everybody is going through. And even if we work all of these notions about hate and you remove yourself all of these aspects of hate from your own experience, the way you view the world, that will not make you a perfect citizen or ideal citizen. You will still be a normal human being with fragilities and weaknesses and strengths and pride and shame at the same time. And that is something that I would like to mention because we were talking about success today. Don't expect to be that this person who was very on an extreme spectrum to be this great open-minded liberal person that thinks through a liberal lens at the society. That will not, most of the times that will not be the case. He or she will still have their specific frame of looking at the world, still have their weaknesses, but you will see a great strength that has emerged from this individual, and that's a beautiful thing to see.
What a wonderful way to end this panel. Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you for the conversation.